former lecturer at the Faculty of Law in Intellectual Property. We have to give Betty her place in Ghana's legal development. She did a lot with intellectual property, putting the Bandero system together and working with Kojo Intri and others. Not many people give Betty credit for that. She's quite well known to me. And she sent me a text the other day, a few years ago, when Martin Amidu was appointed. I'll look for the text and I'll read it for you. I won't tell you what was in it. But sometimes I look at the text like that from people like Betty, and I know that I have to eat humble pie, because on that night she was fighting with me for promoting the Martin Amidu appointment. She actually used certain words for Martin in the text that she sent to me. Well, she was proven right. 2 years later, Martin Amidu conducted express conduct in a way that sort of justifies some of the things that Betty was saying. So on the Martin Amidu matter, those of you who know Betty Mould, tell her that I have eaten humble pie on the argument we had over what Martin Amidu's potential role could be in developing the anti-corruption narrative of the judicial system of Ghana by he being the first special prosecutor so appointed under the Special Prosecutors Act. That I'll look for that text and read it. But here's Betty Mould. She's flown the flag of Ghana impressively, as well as the director of the Commonwealth's Legal Secretariat. That was the last job that she did before she became the Attorney General of Ghana. And she worked for many years at the Attorney General's department, rising all the way to become a Chief State Attorney. Okay, I'm going to talk about her because she's issued a statement relating to this whole judiciary issue. But before I do that, I'd like to put her in the NDC's historical perspective. So there's a story that is known to some of you that some of you are going to find out right now. So we're looking at Betty Mould and John Mahama. Do we have John Mahama here? Correct. So this is President Mahama, and we're looking at President Mahama and Betty Mould Iddrisu, the story before the story. So you know that President Mahama became the running mate of the NDC in 2008, and it was as a result of this running mate that threw President Mahama up on top of the NDC pegging order. He became second to Mills in the campaign. President Mahama's supporters believe that the 2008 election that was won by the NDC by the skin of their teeth, a difference of 25,000 votes with 8 million people voting, was fundamentally because John Dramani Mahama energized the ticket. So John Mahama's supporters believe that wholeheartedly. Well, his opponents in the NDC think that it was Professor Mills and his Asumdue leadership, anti-corruption perspective and all of that. They think that's what made it, but that argument is still going on. It will go on for a long time to come because we don't have any data to support either side. But in this, John Mahama, President Mahama becoming the running mate, from the story I'm telling you today, I like to christen it this way. Betty Mould came second in that encounter. You know, Betty came second in the encounter, didn't she? Because she was the candidate of the Rawlingses, and here they are. This is Flight Lieutenant Rawlings and Anakunedu Ajiman Rawlings. And I speak here more about Anakunedu Ajiman Rawlings. We have not given that woman her place in the development of this country. You know, she did 2 or 3 major epochal changes that reshaped our society. She began the campaign through 31st of limiting population growth when she pushed for families to have 2 children only instead of 7 and 8 and 9 that they were having. She did a major campaign for that. After that, she pushed for people to educate their female children. They used to call it girl child. Send your girl child to school. You remember that? Send your girl child to school. All of those things were done under the auspices of Mrs. Rawlings. If you talk to people like Spielgabra and people like the late P.V. Obey, they'll tell you that Mrs. Rawlings is a master brain. You know, so she developed these things that we have not given her credit for. She did a population limits for the people, especially in the towns and villages. 31st December, women's movement campaigned across the country, asking women to have 2 children so that they are strong, so they can work and all that. Then she led from Africa, the Beijing conference about empowering women. And she's been talking then about empowering women. So in 2008, she, I believe, convinced Flight Lieutenant Rawlings that if the NDC were to win the election, they have to do something new on the ticket, and they should have a woman on the ticket. So the campaign became very strong. Flight Lieutenant Rawlings entered and said that let's Professor Mills select a female running mate, which has happened now though with the NDC, but it didn't happen then. So their candidate, Mr. Rawlings and Mrs. Rawlings' candidate, was Betty Mould Iddrisu for Professor Mills, not John Dramani Mahama, who eventually became and later became president. So if the history had gone the other way now, let me digress a bit and tell you about a book that maybe you should look for. I've forgotten what the title is, but it's by a British journalist, and he writes about elections in the world. And then he specializes on if this particular election had gone the other way. So I'll give you an example. So if he was writing about election 2008, he would have said, if the election 2008 had gone the other way, which would have meant that Akufo-Addo had won, Akufo-Addo would have been president, Bawumia would have been vice president, this person would have been that person would have been that person would have been that. That's how he writes it. And then it sort of brings you a very graphic picture of how different the society and policies could have been within the period of the 4 years of that era. So you pick 2012, and you say if 2012 had gone the other way, Akufo-Addo would have won. So you go to say 2016, and you say 2016 had gone the other way, John Mahama would have been retained as president, or Mane Buama would have been that, Sami James-Field would have been that, this one would have been that. And then you come to 2020. So if 2020 had gone the other way, John Dramani Mahama would have been president, maybe Kevin Taylor would be information minister, maybe Vomaho, what's his name again? First the country would have been labor minister, all of that, yeah. So that's interesting. So when you look at this story, come back to our story, if the events of 2008 had gone the other way, and if the Rawlingses had succeeded in convincing President Mills that Betty Mould Iddrisu should have been the running mate, the story would have been completely different. Betty Mould would have been the running mate, not John Mahama. And if the NDC had won the election in 2008, Betty Mould would have been vice president. When the unfortunate event of 24 July 2012 occurred, Betty Mould would have been sworn in as president. So Betty Mould is an important person in NDC, holding this history, which I'm sure that her supporters are thinking of how we can get it back. But the tension of the event, I'm bringing you a video so you can remember the tension of the event. All this leading to the Betty story, so don't worry about it. Just a bit of gossip is always useful to give you a background to the story. So the event was so tense, and all of us journalists didn't know what was going to happen, because Professor Mills was due to announce his running mate at the Kama Conference Center on a particular day, and the running mate issue had become a big story. Days before that, Professor Mills had said, he had been asked that, your running mate issue is becoming a big story. Where are we? And he said that he was disappointed that whilst they are talking about the Rawlings camp has a candidate, the Adom-Otchere camp has a candidate, nobody is talking about the Mills camp. And that his Mills and the Mills camp also have a candidate. So that then told people that it looks like Prof was going to stand his ground. Everyone knew that President Rawlings and Mrs. Rawlings were promoting Betty Mould Iddrisu. So then comes Kama Conference Center. All the journalists are there. Flight Lieutenant Rawlings is there. Everyone is going to wait for Professor Mills to announce his running mate. Now see, guess what happens? Professor Mills does not show up at the event. We're all there. He doesn't show up. Instead, he hands over a paper from his office in Kuku Hill to be given to one of his trusted lieutenants, Elvis Efri-Ankra, to deliver the announcement. This is what happened on that fateful day. Have a look.
Professor Mills has named Honorable John Dramani Mahama as his vice presidential candidate for the 2008 elections. A decision which has been unanimously approved by the National Executive Committee.
That's the only time in the history of the Fourth Republic that the candidate himself did not name his running mate. He did not even show up at the event. That's as a result of the tension. So Betty is a shadow vice president candidate then, so she came second to the ticket that eventually brought John Dramani Mahama into focus into political leadership on the presidential ticket, and eventually he won as vice president with Professor Mills, and was later sworn in 2012, and then also won the election in December 2012. Flight Lieutenant Rawlings and Mrs. Rawlings did not get their way, but the work that Mrs. Rawlings had done in pushing up the female agenda should not be underestimated, and it should always be recognized.